called a new logarithmic function, and I discussed various properties. So that was a time when my father was director of the Math Science Institute, and he said, it's one thing for you to say things are new, but you should write to great mathematicians, and they should evaluate your work. So somebody said you should write to Paul Erdos, and he will like problems like this, and he will tell you how good your result is. But how do you write to Erdos? He is sort of traveling all over the world, and this is not the days of email, right? Pre-email. So I was told, write your letter to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and they will direct you to Paul Erdos. So we wrote a letter to the Hungarian Academy, and within 2 weeks, we get a reply from Professor Erdos saying, these results are very nice. I am soon coming to Calcutta for the 100th birth anniversary conference of Mahalanobis, the founder of the Indian Statistical Institute. Will you be there? If so, we can talk. Interestingly, I had sent my paper for presentation at that conference, and it was accepted for presentation at that conference, but I couldn't go because I was in my third BSc and I had to write my half-yearly exams in December. My father, who was a well-known probabilist, was invited to give an hour lecture. Mine was in the student section. Mine was a 15-minute presentation. So my father was giving an hour lecture, and he was going. So I told my father, I will tell you what my results are, give me my paper, will you present my work? So he said, I will present your work, but I will not take any questions. Deal. So my father was going to present my work. And I wrote to Professor Erdos saying, next month, the conference there, I won't be there, but my father will be presenting my work. And Professor Erdos attended my father's presentation of my work in the student section of the conference. It was not one of the plenary talks. After the talk, he goes up to my father and says, I am very pleased to meet you, but I will be much happier to meet your son. So how does one arrange it? My father said, no, my son is in Madras and he is writing his exam, so he cannot come. So then Erdos says, next week I have to be in Sydney, and I have 1 week in between. I'm supposed to fly to Singapore and go to Sydney, but I will reroute my trip, fly to Madras to meet your son. So imagine. This is not even to do with my mathematics, but it shows Erdős' generosity and his commitment to meet young mathematicians. So he came to Madras. And I went to the airport to meet him, like I received, Sinai Robbins was received at night. And I was very nervous. I was meeting this great mathematician. What do I tell him? But fortunately, I didn't have to tell him anything. He started the conversation. Hello, are you Krishna? Yes. He says, do you know my poem about the city of Madras?
Huh?
I said, no.
What?
This to the city of Madras, the home of the curry and the dal, where Ayers speak only to Iyengars, Iyengars speak only to God. So he sort of understood this Brahminical aristocracy that dominates Madras and the pecking order and all that. And he said, I've not heard this poem. And he said, this is modeled along a poem for the city of Boston.
Oh.
This to the city of Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells speak only to Cabots and the Cabots speak only to God. So that's a Boston Brahmin. So he understood this intellectual superiority feelings of Madras and so on, and he coined this poem. So he immediately put me at ease. He was a mathematician who was joking and so on. So I spent 2 days with him when he was here. We walked along the Marina Beach, and he was asking what these buildings were and so on. But we were discussing mathematics all the time. So what I told Professor Erdos was, I have proved all these results on the average of the number of prime factors, some of the prime factors. But I know this is not the normal order. In other words, in this case, I knew that the large values dominate. Okay, and so this is not the most commonly occurring value. But I said, I have not been able to determine the most commonly occurring value. He thought for a moment and he said, I don't think you can determine the most commonly occurring value. It's not something that can be determined. It has no normal order. And he says, I'll tell you why. Because in your sum, you order the prime factors. The largest prime factor will be so big most of the time, it will dominate the sum of the rest. And since the largest prime factor then behaves randomly, you cannot pin down the size, the most commonly occurring size. So he told me this at the Madras beach. So I asked him, Professor Erdos, if the largest prime factor dominates the whole sum, if I remove it, will the second largest prime factor dominate the rest?
Yes.
If I remove that, will the third largest prime factor dominate the rest? And so on. He said, that's a very good question. Why don't you prove the theorem? So he gave me references. So we corresponded over the next several weeks. And our first paper, joint paper, which appeared in the Pacific Journal of Mathematics, called an additive arithmetical function, proves this fact that the largest prime factor dominates, you subtract it, the second largest dominates, and so on. And this is one of my most quoted papers because it was the first serious discussion of the sum of the prime factors of a number. So anybody who works in the sum of the prime factor number will refer to this, and I'm glad to say that AFN is referred to as the Alladi Erdos function. So the books on analytic. The notation AFN still holds, but it's called the Alladi Erdos function because Erdos and I wrote this paper. And the reference is given there to my very first paper that I wrote as a student at Vivekananda College. But this paper was written when I was a PhD student at UCLA. So
I remember at that time how your name was flashed all over the papers here. As a boy who has done wonders.
Anyway.
As college students,
Yeah, he knows me as the student. There are two books on Paul Erdos. This book is called My Brain is Open. So whenever you used to talk to Erdos and he's ready to discuss with you, he'll say, yes, go ahead, my brain is open. So this is the book. And the opening chapter is called Traveling, first chapter, and tells you how Erdos travels around the world to meet young people. And the very first story, page 3, is how he came to Madras to meet me, and this poem on Ayers Iyengar.
Cute, very cute.
This is wonderful. So I wrote 5 joint papers with Erdos, and I don't want to get into details, but let me say some things about his coming to India. So this was